Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week I am joined by Evelyn Grossman. Evelyn is the author of Hidden in Berlin, a Holocaust Memoir, which details her parents' separate stories of survival during World War II. Over the course of today's episode, Evelyn describes her parents' stories and the unique ways her parents survived Nazi Germany. We also take a look at their lives after World War II and Evelyn's work towards bringing their stories to light. So with that, let's get into today's episode. Welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am joined today by Evelyn Grossman to talk about her book, Hidden in Berlin. Evelyn, if you want to introduce yourself a little.
Hi, Madison. Thank you for having me. Yes, my name is Evelyn Grossman. I am the daughter of Elizabeth and Ernst Joseph, who came to the U.S. in 1948 after World War II. They survived the Holocaust in hiding. There are really two separate stories, my mother's and my father's story, that I learned gradually over the years. A person has never sat down and said, here's the story. It's sort of things come out over time, and then as you get older, you put pieces together. I have written a book called Hidden in Berlin, and it's the story both of my parents' life in Germany before Hitler came to power, their lives during the war, their survival, how they came to America after the war, and then how we recognize the rescuers. There were two sets of rescuers as righteous among the nations.
I appreciate how your book goes farther past the end of World War II. I really liked how you went throughout their whole lives, not just until the end of World War II and after they were able to come back out of having to be hidden. I really appreciated that we were able to see where your family ended up.
Thank you.
Do you want to start with your parents' story, either
Sure.
your father or your mother?
Sure. I wanted to bring out that both of them grew up in homes that were assimilated. They were Jewish. They identified as being Jewish, but they were also very German. My mother's father, my grandfather, served in the Great War, World War I, and earned the Iron Cross First Class, which he was extremely proud of. He wore the ribbons on his jacket all the time, and he believed that would protect him. It was a symbol of his patriotism, his loyalty to Germany, and he believed when Hitler came to power, he thought it wouldn't last, that the Germans would throw him out soon, that Hitler was a crazy man and this was a temporary thing. He never wanted to leave Germany. He thought that the Germans would see into Hitler, and he felt that this was his homeland. Sadly, my father's family was also very German for many generations. They had a little business in the Central Market. My father had an older brother who got out of Germany in 1938, before the war started. He had already earned a PhD from the university, and he came under the reasonings of studying to come to America. In reality, he came looking for a sponsor. In those years, if you wanted to leave Germany, you needed somebody to give you an affidavit, basically to say to the government, I support these people. They will not be a burden to the U.S. economy. They won't be on welfare. If they need help, I will provide that. He came to America in 1938. The U.S. was still having terrible unemployment situation. He had a hard time finding somebody. Eventually, and it goes through in my book, he did find somebody. He worked for him for a while. And then my Uncle Gerhard, sent affidavits to Germany to bring out his parents and his brother. But the U.S. quotas for people to come out of Germany was so long. There were so many people trying to come out that the officials basically told them, you're on the list, but it'll take a long time. So basically the doors were closing, and then as things progressed to get worse and they saw they couldn't get out, my grandfather lost his business. He had to do janitorial work, and my father did construction work. And he started then looking for a place of hiding. I could tell you a little more about my mother's family if you like.
Let's go into
Her
the
background,
story.
thank you, was basically her father was into the arts. He was an actor as a young man after he came home from the war. He loved the theater. They had a nice life, and my mother went to a school called Bismarck Lyceum, a girls' school, a private school in Berlin. This becomes important because eventually during the war there was a schoolmate, a classmate at that school who saves my mother. And that's why that school has a very important role in my mother's life and her survival. But briefly about her family, my mother would always say, life in Berlin, she thought was wonderful. She went ice skating with her brother and biking, and they would go shopping. And to her, there was no anti-Semitism. Now, of course, you don't know my mother, but my mother had the best pair of rose-colored glasses. She would see what she wanted to see. And also, though I believe in Berlin, it probably wasn't the same as on the outskirts of Germany. So perhaps indeed the amount of anti-Semitism wasn't that great in the city. Nevertheless, when she was in school after Hitler came to power, she could stay in school one extra year because of her father's service. Then she was thrown out along with the other Jewish children. For a while, she went to a Jewish school and learned about Theodor Herzl, and she learned about Zionism. But her biggest influence on Judaism came from a rabbi, Rabbi Joachim Prinz, who warned Berlin Jews about the anti-Semitism outside of Berlin. He was charismatic. He attracted people to come. He invited teenagers to come to his house for Shabbat. They loved him. He also attracted the Gestapo. They started coming to his services. They started harassing him, and he eventually left and came to America. He became a rabbi in Newark, New Jersey. He became involved with the civil rights movement here in the U.S. He marched on the Civil Rights March in August of 1963, and then got up and he made a speech at the civil rights ceremonies in Washington, D.C. that no one remembers, because at that time then Martin Luther King Jr. got up and made a speech saying, "I have a dream." And right after that, Rabbi Prince got up, but no one remembers that speech. Basically, what he had to say was the biggest problem is silence. People not speaking up, people going along with the government and not speaking up. So he worked tirelessly to convince people the importance of that. Okay, shall I fast forward to what happens later, I guess? Yes.
Yeah, we
Um,
can look into their different experiences during World War II and their different situations when it came to hiding.
the situation obviously got worse after 38. That was Kristallnacht, after my father's family knew that they had no place to go. My father started searching for a hiding place. In those years, a young man could live on the streets, go from house to house perhaps, or a friend. My father needed a hiding place for his parents and himself. Very hard to find a hiding place for three people. Through luck or through divine intervention, a person who he knew in Germany said, "I know this couple in the middle of Germany who are willing to take you." And I remember my father telling me, my father died a long time ago when I was in college, and so unfortunately we didn't have enough conversations. Fortunately, my mother lived until the age of 97 and just died 5 years ago. So much of this book actually comes from conversations we've had. I would sit in her kitchen with the tape recorder running, and I would say, "Okay, Mom, tell me again the name of the street where you lived. Where did Dad live?" And I would go home and I'd put it in notes and do research. One of the hardest things my father faced was, who do you trust? Just because somebody tells you, "I know someone who'll take you in," you don't know if it's a trap. And in those years, the deportations had started, people were turned in, and my father could not decide whether to trust this information or ignore it. But at that time, deportations were escalating, and he knew by not doing nothing would have led to eventual deportation. He took a chance, and it turned out to be a good decision. These people indeed were honest, they were anti-Hitler, they were German, they had no Jewish connection. They didn't have great means, but they had humanity, and they wanted to do what they could against Hitler. So they lived in what they called a Hinterhaus. This is an apartment building not on the main street, a house behind the main street. And this is in the center of Berlin, the area called Kreuzberg. It's a working class neighborhood. They had a small room, roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, where my father and his parents could stay in hiding. And they stayed there for 27 months. My father's parents never left that room. They had a bathroom down the hall, but they never went outside. So they're there in this little room in the middle of Berlin. Now, in those years, the German government gave ration cards to people, meaning you were allocated so much food, so many ounces perhaps of meat or butter. But once you go into hiding, you can't use ration cards. You cease to exist. You can't go to an authority and say, here's my ration card. You would be picked up immediately. So the people who took in my father and his parents had those cards. They had cards enough for two people, not for three more people, a total of five. So immediate problem was food. And my father, they expected that. They packed some cans to go with them when they went in hiding, but that soon ran out. So what do? They had taken some money in hiding and they had some contacts from business before. My father would go out on the street in the early mornings when there weren't that many people and go to the markets to people who he trusted and buy food minimal. They had, of course, no idea how long this was going to last, and he would bring this food back to his parents and himself. Being on the street as a young man of military age was dangerous. Easier for a woman, but for a man, why aren't you in the army? And if you were stopped and asked for your papers, the only papers my father had was an identification card that identified him as a Jew, and he couldn't use that. So being stopped meant deportation. So it was a terrible risk every time he went out. There was also the risk of neighbors who, if somebody would see him, like, who is this man walking outside this building? I never saw him before. I think not just for my father, but for the many books I've read, all honesty, luck, God, whatever, plays a big role in everybody's survival. Despite having good people who saved them, there are forces you cannot control. And those are the neighbors. Those are the police on the street. Those are unknown factors. Now, what mostly went well, except for a few times. One time, the place where my father and family were in hiding in the center of Berlin, there was a munitions factory nearby. Now, the Allies then were targeting, when they targeted Berlin, they were aiming at those munitions factory. It used to, when the war started, they were staying away from civilian areas, and civilians' death were collateral damage. That changed in time. They were more likely to hit areas with civilians. They once hit this area near where they were in hiding. When the alarms go off, people go into shelters, into bomb shelters. You can't go into a bomb shelter if you're in hiding. You can't sit in a bomb shelter with others if you aren't supposed to live. So when the sirens went off, the people who protected my father and parents, the Pisarius, they went in the shelters, which was expected, but not my father and his parents. So you would sit and you would pray and you would hope the bombs don't hit you. They were lucky, except for one time. The bombs came very close, and it destroyed the wall of their building. It was gone. So when the sirens stopped and they knew they could come out, the Pisarius ran out to see what happened. As afraid of the building, they were even more afraid to have their secret exposed, the people they were hiding. They run back and they immediately took them out of that room and put them in their main apartment, closed it off so if any neighbors were going around, well, this is terrible, we have a calamity, but they wouldn't see these people in hiding. So now you have a wall that's down. Well, fortunately, Paul Pisarius, had skills as a carpenter. So he took some of his ration cards, bought wood, and nails or whatever he needed and constructed a temporary wall, constructed a wall. So they went on. They could fix that wall. They went back into hiding, and life continued. But the point is, this goes on, and you, of course, you have no idea how much longer you're going to be there. My father also faced problems when he would be on the street. Once he was on it, they had like these above ground trains, sort of, I guess, trolleys. And there were the police who came and asked for identification. My father knew, again, I can't be asked. So he literally, as they came to a stop, jumped off the train. Fearful he would be stopped. He didn't run. He didn't want to attract attention. He walked. He walked calmly and slowly away. And once again, he was lucky. So this continued for the 27 months in hiding. There is the story of my grandfather not surviving, which was one of the hardest things of the whole experience. My father's father had a heart condition. He had that before the war. He had medicine. And they brought some into hiding. But again, when you're in hiding, you don't have medicine. You don't go to the drugstore. And my grandfather had heart problems. So what does my father do? He can't bring him to a hospital. He can't get a doctor to come. And my grandfather dies while in hiding. He's there in this room. They are there in a small room with my grandfather dead. You've got a dead body in this room. You cannot have a burial. You cannot go out and dig a grave. What do you do? This was a terrible, terrible situation. So what happened was, and this was February of 1945, the war is going, no one knows when the war ends. The war ends in May, but that's for us to know in hindsight. They didn't know. So what they had to do was, my father and Paul Pisarius wrapped the blanket of my grandfather, the dead body, in a blanket, took off any kind of identification, nothing to identify who this man was. They put him on a cart with a bicycle to pull it. In the middle of the night, in the dark of the night, they took this cart out. Near the apartment is the River Spree, which runs through Berlin. They walked quietly to the river, hoping that no one would stop and say, "What are you doing? What do you have there?" Praying that they could go without being detected, without being questioned. They get to the river and they take the body and put it in the water. It is a cold night. It is a dark night. But there is nothing else you can do. This act plagued my father for decades afterwards, and it's something I knew but we never talked about. I think his guilt on what he had to do haunted him, but the reality of the Holocaust, of the war, leaves little options. He could not expose the people protecting him. He couldn't leave a body there. There isn't a choice. Wars leave you with horrible situations, and this was one of them. They get back to the room, and fortunately there is not any consequence on the outside. They continue their lives. I want to mention one other important thing. When my father would go out to buy food, he would often stop at a prearranged meeting to see my mother. Now, as I mentioned initially, this is my story. It's really two stories in the beginning. My mother's father never wanted to leave Berlin. There was an option for the Kindertransport where children were taken, and my mother's mother wanted so badly to have the children go. But her husband said, no, we stay together. Anyway, as the years go by before their deportation, there's something called Zwangsarbeit, which means forced labor. So my mother and her brother were out doing Zwangsarbeit, which was really working in a factory. They come home from there and they see a note on the front door. The door is sealed, and the note is telling them to come to the deportation center. The Gestapo had come to their house. The Gestapo had taken her mother and father, my grandparents, to the deportation center, and had ordered my mother and her brother to also appear. In those days, the Gestapo in Germany was trying to hide what was going on. They told people, you're being relocated. Pack a suitcase, bring some warm clothes, bring some food, bring a suitcase, and we're going to take you to another center, and you're going to be transported someplace. No one thought what actually happened would have happened. There were hints, but no one really knew. So when my mother and her brother saw that, they knew they were not going to comply. They were young, and they would try to find their way on their own. They went to a German lady who was like their nanny when they were little, and she saw them at the door and immediately knew what had gone on and took them in. Now, life doesn't follow a straight line. Just because you have somebody protecting you doesn't mean, okay, life is fine, I got to protect her. This woman lived in an apartment building, lots of people nearby, and her house got bombed. It was a big building. She could not safely protect them anymore. They had to leave. She didn't feel safe keeping them. So here my mother is 21 and he's 23. So they're young adults. They're not children. They're young adults. They're literally living on the streets, going from place to place, trying to meet up at night. And one night when my mother's brother doesn't appear, she knows but doesn't know. Sometimes people can't come back to the meeting place. Sometimes people are detained. And you hope that you will meet up in the future. But my mother had no money, she had no family, and she's literally walking the streets. And she would tell me I was almost ready to turn myself in. I mean, I had no food. I didn't know what to do. She's walking. And somebody calls out her name. Her nickname was Lilo. And someone calls out, Lilo, wait. My mother was fearful. You can't trust people. The world, it's such a different world. And the woman calls out again, Lilo, wait, I want to talk to you. And then she recognizes the voice, a familiar voice. And this was the woman, her name was Eva Kasira. Mom knew Eva from those days at the Bismarck Lyceum when they were schoolmates. Eva was a very wealthy girl. It wasn't like Mom and Eva were best friends. They were in different circles, but they knew of one another. Eva looks at my mother and says to her, do you have a place to sleep? My mother says no. Eva looks at her, hands her some money, and says, come to my house at night. Maybe my mother can help you. So that was fantastic. My mother goes out to this house. Now, this house in Berlin, this house where they live was called Grunewald. It's the area by the forest. It's the nicest area in Berlin. There are large houses. They are beautiful. They are far recessed from the road. And my mother goes there and she is nervous. What is going to happen? Is this person going to let me stay? I don't think my mother feared being betrayed. She trusted Eva, but she wasn't sure if the mother would be agreeable. She didn't think the way my father felt this could be a trap, but she didn't know what would happen. So she knocks on this door, this big house. The woman lets her in and looks at her and says she will let her stay. My mother could work there as a maid, and she would have room and board, but she must not tell anybody where she lives. If that ever happens, she'll throw her out. To my mother, this was unbelievable. She has a bed, she has food, she has shelter. The problem in this house is her name is Hanna Zutschik, entertains Nazis. She brings lots of Nazis in her house. I met Eva years later. I never met the mother. I almost feel listening to the stories, it was very strategic on the mother. She wanted to remain on good terms with these Nazis. She wanted them to trust her, to think she's a nice lady. She's given us some food and some liquor and whatever, and we'll leave her alone. But my mother would say that in those years you had to take people in who lost their homes. So different people would sleep in this house. Sometimes they were Nazis, sometimes they were, who knows who they were. And Mrs. Zutchik would say, stay away, try not to talk to any of these people. My mother was 21, 22. She was a very pretty young girl who would have liked to talk to some of these people and flirt a bit. She knew the danger, and yet they would approach her, and she would try to stay away as much as she could. There was a time they had a big dinner party, and there was a Bulgarian gentleman who came in the kitchen and said, you shouldn't be a maid here. I don't want to know your story, but come with me and I'll help you. Of course, my mother just said to this man, I'm happy here. I have a good, and tried to stay away. And she told this story to Mrs. Zutchik. I guess I cannot overemphasize how little you could trust people, how little you could take what people would say at face value. So just of how her life was there. The other very, very important thing I want to talk about is that Mrs. Zutchik didn't want people to know my mother lived there. She pretended that this maid had a place to live and she just came into work. So if there were people staying overnight at the house, my mother would formally say Guten Abend, good night to everybody there and leave. Outside, there was an underground bomb shelter, very small, was almost in the dirt. Mom had a flashlight. She'd find the grate, open it up, and go down in the dirt. And literally stay in the dirt for a long time. She would then walk out when she hoped it was safe. The top floor of this building, the bedroom had shutters. If the shutters were closed, that was Ava's sign, do not come in. There are people up, it is not safe. Stay out. Once the shutters opened, it was the sign, it's safe, you can come back in the house. My mother talked to me about being outside. Besides the obvious fear, there were bombs. There were squirrels, there were people walking, but they were at a distance. There was far recessed from the ground. But this also went out, being out in the cold, being exposed that way, and not knowing whether it was safe to come inside. So her life there was a series of safety, yet nevertheless there was danger all around her at all times. Along with this was the fact that my father, when he did his food runs, would try to have prearranged times to meet my mother. My father was very good at planning things, and they would meet, except that one time he didn't show up at the designated time. And my mother couldn't call him. She didn't even know where he lived. My father would never told her. My father knew where my mother lived, but not vice versa. And I understand that because my father had little protection. He couldn't risk the danger to his parents and himself and the people saving him. But anyway, so one day my father doesn't show up. And my mother doesn't know, was he caught? Was somebody sick? The biggest fear was he caught? Did he not show up because he was caught? She just went home. And my father then later contacted somebody else to leave a message for my mother that I will meet you at the same place in 2 weeks. They come back and they meet. And my father tells my mother what happens to his father. He tells my mother the whole story of his father dying. There's obviously nothing my mother can do. She listens, and they just stand there, and they listen, and they hug. And they know they have to go on. It's February, but not knowing what the future will be. And that probably was one of the most difficult moments in the time. Well, there's another really difficult moment. Should I keep going? Okay.
Yeah.
You have a question?
Not necessarily, but I do think we should bring up the neighbor of the family she was staying with that was part of a high ranking officer in the Nazi party and his military coup.
Yes, it was July, I think it was 1944. There was an assassination attempt of Hitler. Uh, there was a movie made from that. Forgetting the actor in the movie, I have to look that up. But the attempt was that one of the Nazis, they were trying to kill Hitler, where he brings this suitcase into this meeting with Hitler and other high-ranking Nazis, and he has the suitcase sitting next to him with a bomb inside. The plot was he's to go out to take a phone call or whatever, and then the bomb is to detonate and kill Hitler, obviously, and the others. Well, he goes out, takes the phone call, the bomb goes off, but the suitcase is positioned near a leg of a table that thwarts the impact of the bomb. Hitler is not destroyed. He's not killed. It was July 21st, 1944. There was an assassination attempt on the life of the Fuhrer, General Olbricht, Olbricht. He was one of the chief architects. It was known as Operation Valkyria. That was the name of the operation. Okay, there was a young officer, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Roll. He was carrying a bomb hidden in his suitcase, and that bomb went off. 4 people were killed, but Hitler was only slightly wounded. This General Olbricht and Stauffenberg were arrested and executed. This General Olbricht lived about two doors away from where my mother was in hiding during the war. And Mrs. Zutchik knew he was a big military man, but always thought we need to avoid him. He's one of the Nazis. Don't go near him. Don't even walk by that house. Because my mother walked outside freely, but she was afraid of this person. He was a Nazi. What did she know? But indeed, this was a person who was trying to kill Hitler. And the point is, those years, not only can you not trust people who could be bad, you couldn't trust people who turned out to be good because you had no way of knowing the difference between
There
the
was
two
no way
people.
to know who was. You just had to trust or not interact.
Exactly, exactly. There was no way to know the difference between the people. So that was an amazing story. And one more amazing thing was towards the end of the war, when the Allies came in and the Russians came in, it was a terrible time in Berlin. The Russians were angry. They were angry at the Germans for all the killing, for all the destruction they had done in Stalingrad and all the deaths. And they came into Berlin with revenge. They wanted revenge for all the murders. They raped, they stole, they vandalized, and they were furious. Mrs. Uchuk was prepared. What she did was she took all her valuable paintings, which she had many of, and stored them in the basement, and put some inexpensive artwork up. Took off all her nice jewelry and put on costume jewelry. Put on an old kerchief, made herself look old and unattractive. Hid her daughter and my mother in the basement along with another woman who was staying there. So when the Russians came in, Mrs. Zutchik didn't stop them. She let them run around. She said, and they said, women, Frauen, looking for women. And she said, no women here. They looked all over. They didn't go in the basement, which was also amazing. But my mother and Ava heard them. They heard these Russians stomping on the floor. They heard them yelling. They heard the furniture breaking. And they stayed there in the basement. At night when they left, Mrs. Zutchik came down to give them some food and have them go to the bathroom, but said, you can't come up. They may come back. They did come back the next day. They came back and they brought some bread and butter for the nice old lady who was nice to them. Now this again was a total miracle, that they weren't found, that they weren't raped, because there was so much going on there. There was so much terrible things going on. But again, they survived. So now the war is over. And my mother said to me, there's no celebration. It isn't like you're out on the streets dancing. It's more like this exhale if it's over, but what do you do? Everything is destroyed. My mother is hoping that her brother is still alive. She doesn't have much hope for her parents because they were older, but her brother was young, strong, and perhaps he'll live. But the immediate worry right after the war is, what do you do? Where do you go? Where do you live? So Mrs. Zuchik offers to keep my mother, not as a maid, offers to send her to school, and she would live there as almost as a second daughter. And my mother seriously considered it, but she decided she couldn't. She'd always be the maid. She'd always feel indebted. She'd always want to please her, and she wanted her freedom. She didn't want to continue living with this deep gratitude and constantly feeling she had to. She couldn't break that piece of her life, so she left. My father went back to the place where his house was, but it was destroyed. They could not return there. Now, the war is over, and the US government and the British and the French divide up Berlin into different quarters, an American, a French, a Russian, and a British. And they're helping people who come out of hiding. Now, in terms of number, there were 55,000 Jews in Berlin who were deported to the camps. There were 1,400 Jews who went into hiding and who came out afterwards. Of those 1,400, there were my mother, my father, and my grandmother, which I think is just an amazing thing to think about. Anyway, my father gets an apartment in the British section, which many rooms. My mother thinks it must have been some high official Nazi said it was huge. It had lots of rooms and furniture. So finally she goes in, they all have their separate places, and they start to rebuild their lives there. So I was going to pause a moment to let you ask any questions you might have.
Yeah. I don't have any questions per se. I just think that both of their stories are more unique in the space of survivor stories that I've heard, especially with how present your parents still were in the community. Like your mom, she was in a house with a woman who hosted. She was being seen all the time. And your father leaving once a week to go out into town. I just think that's something that I haven't really heard before in the other stories I've heard of survivors. I just think it's something unique that I haven't heard before. And I think that's amazing that they were able to live and survive in an area where they were more out in the open than others.
Yeah, that's true. Um, if you like, I would like to talk about how we honored them years later. Okay, so fast forward, war is over. My father's brother, Uncle Gerhard, who came to America, settled in Trenton, New Jersey, because that's where he was sponsored. He marries a woman from the area. They have kids. And so eventually my parents, they get married there and they come to America. They come to Trenton, New Jersey, which is where I'm born. Life is hard. My father works in factories and my mother, but they build a new life. My father does die of a heart attack when he is 56, and heart issues are big in my family, not a good sign. But anyway, many years later, I'm going to fast forward to 1988, and I'll tell you why. It is now 50 years after Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was in 1938, November. My synagogue, the Jewish Center in Princeton, wants to commemorate the Kristallnacht. I'm a member there, and they asked my mother to speak of her firsthand experiences during Kristallnacht. So she gets up, and she has a German accent. If anyone knows Dr. Ruth, my mother was a Dr. Ruth kind of person. She's small, and she has that kind of expressions. She tells her story about her life. And after her speech is finished, a woman in the congregation comes up to me and says, Evie, I think I know a cousin of Ava Kassira, the person who saved your mom. And I looked at her with complete disbelief, thinking, this is Princeton, New Jersey. My mother's story is Berlin. The two have nothing in common. And she says, this woman is a psychiatrist, and she has a friend whose husband is German. And she says, let me check. I'll get back to you. She was right. So her friend Isabel Perret is married to Professor Peter Perret, who's at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton. He's a professor of of history. His mother was Suzanne Cassira. Suzanne Cassira and Eva are first cousins. Their fathers were brothers. So Suzanne and Eva had remained close. Eva had told her cousin Suzanne this whole story about what happened during the war. Peter knew the whole story, but never knew what happened to this Jewish woman, what her name was, or what happened to her after the war. But he knew the entire story. So after this initial introduction, I go to the Institute of Advanced Studies and I meet Professor Perret and his wife, and we talk for a long time. And he tells me more about Eva, about who she is. Then, fast forward to 1995. It is now 50 years after the end of World War II. Germany is trying to make amends for all the terrible things they did, which is impossible. They invite people to come back to revisit their homeland. My mother never wanted to take this trip. But then she decided it was worth it for me to meet Eva because Mom and Eva they would exchange cards. They never talked, but they would exchange greeting cards. She said, I want to go. It's 1995. My mother is holding this bunch of roses in the plane and caring for them with little vials of water. We get off the plane. Eva is standing there with red roses also. The two women exchange identical flowers. And you want to take a picture. You want to hold this moment. And of course, it goes quickly. But I get to meet Eva. I get to see the house where my mother was in hiding. And it is a little bit, it's worn. It's worn over the ages. It's still huge, but it shows signs of age. Anyway, the most important part is we get to say our thank yous. We get to say thank you for what she did, and we get to see a lot of Berlin. I leave Berlin thinking I need to honor her. Her mother had died, but I need to have her as righteous among the nations. Years later, I finally do this. The way you honor somebody, you write the story, but it needs to be collaborated by a third party. Your story needs to be collaborated by a source outside of you for its authenticity. Well, I had Professor Perret. Professor Perret knew the whole story outside of me. I didn't tell him anything. He knew it independently. So I write my application, he writes his, and it gets approved. So that we get a letter from Yad Vashem saying they will be honoring both Eva Cassira and her mother, Hannah Zuchik, as righteous among the nations. We start the process. Eva is still alive, but she's elderly, and sadly, by the time it's finished, Eva has passed away. When it comes time for the ceremony, we ask Professor Perret to accept the award on behalf of his family. Reluctantly, he does. He's a professor he feels I don't deserve this award. It doesn't belong to me. But to be gracious to my mom, he goes through the ceremony. And immediately, a few days later, what you get when you're honored, you get a medal and a certificate. He sent it all to my mother because he said, I don't belong, and my mother passed away, I now have it. So this is what Yad Vashem creates. It's a medal. I know it's hard for you to see it here, but on it, it does say Hannah Zuchik and daughter Eva Cassira. Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it.
And can you even see the name?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's really cool. The medal
Well,
certificate.
it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to him, but he didn't want it. He sent it to my mother, and it's been in her house till she passed away. So I have it along with the certificate. And I think it's cool also because not many people have this.
Yeah.
And so we were able to have that and honor him. I had not forgotten about my father, but my father had passed away many years before that to honor his rescuers, and I didn't have much contact except for the name Passarius, Paul Passarius on Eisenbahnstrasse. So what do? You start Googling on the internet, you start looking. I find an article in German, I'd been studying German, called Die Eisenbahnstraße, which means the railroad street. The article talks about a man, Paul Pisarius, saving 3 Jews and the father dying and having to take the body and put it into the River Spree. I literally read this article and practically drop my cup of coffee, saying, here is my secret. Here is my story on the internet. How dare this author expose it? We never talked about this. How can this happen? And I was really angry that this was out in the internet. And then the light bulb goes off in my head and said, wait a minute, somebody knows your story. Who is this author? How does this person know your story? So I started searching for the author, Walter Schwab. I thought it was a man. I kept looking, writing various emails. I found Walter, who's a woman, a journalist. And we've communicated. She said when she first got my email, it shocked her too, because she wasn't 100% sure the story she heard was a true story. Real quickly, Walter Schwab, maybe 20 years after the war, we're now in the mid-70s. She's a young graduate student living in the same apartment building on the top floor. And this old man, who's probably in his 80s, tells everybody what he did in the war, saved 3 Jews. People don't believe him, think he's making up a story. But something in her mind thought, maybe it's the truth. I don't know. Maybe, is he lying? Is he fantasizing? So she writes this article and we start communicating. She tells me about the room. She tells me about the people. She sends me a picture. And when it's time to contact Yad Vashem to honor these people, I have my independent source. I have a person to corroborate my story. I have Walter because she knows the story independently. To me, I think I had the greatest luck in both of those situations to honor them. So they do get honored, but then I have no one to accept the award. I have an honor, no relatives, nobody. So what do you do? There is a museum in Germany, in Berlin, called the Silent Heroes. I've been there once, which honors people who rescue Jews, who they're silent heroes. And I contact the curator there. And she says, let me do some research. Let me see what I can find. She locates a man named Werner Pisarius. He is the nephew of Paul. He knows the whole story too. His uncle had come to visit. He knew the whole story. And he was happy to accept the honor. He lived near the Rhine River. We fly out there. There was a minister from Germany who comes out to Berlin to make the awards with Yad Vashem. I get to meet Werner. I'd been studying German mainly for that one moment, so I could talk to him in German to express my deepest thanks. And I give a speech, but I wanted to talk to him in German to express gratitude. And so we have this beautiful ceremony. He has the award. He never gave it back. I'm happy he has it. And I felt that we were able to complete the process of recognizing the courage, the conviction, the moral conviction of 2 sets of Germans who risked their lives to save my mother and my father. And that's the story in a nutshell.
When I was reading through the book, when it got to the part where you found the article, I was like, this is a crazy amount of circumstance to happen. I was like, this is insane. Because I was reading it, I was like, there's no way someone knew this story. Because as you had told the story of the family that your mom was with, and how they were able to get recognized with your father's story, I was just like, this is just amazing that something like this can happen this many years later. That you were able to find that article and be able to go through that process with your father as well. I was like, this is just truly amazing that it was able to happen that way.
A lot of lucky pieces obviously came together for them both to survive, but a lot of lucky pieces came later for me to give them recognition that fell together. So luck plays a big role. Is it God? Is it luck? Or whatever we want to call it. And I've read many Holocaust stories. You probably have too.
Mhm.
I do believe in many people's lives there was incidences of luck that brought them through. Obviously, there was so much horror, but those who survived, it was a combination of luck as well as and strength. People had to have strength and have perseverance and resources, but you could have all of those things and still not make it.
Especially, during the war, like you had mentioned previously, you don't know when it's going to end. It's happening indefinitely when you're in it. Like, as we can see now, we know when the war ended, we know when things started to change, but when you're living it, you don't know when it's going to end. You don't know how much longer you have to be in hiding. Or on the other side, how much longer you are supporting this family or this person that you are hiding, how much longer it can be something that you both or all of you can get through together. Because it was, I don't know if sacrifice is the right word to use, but it was something the families that did hide the Jewish families or Jewish people individually, it was something that they chose to do in defiance of their government. And I think that's really important to also recognize that these people were doing something that could have also ended poorly for them as well if they had been found out.
Absolutely. They were taking great risks to do what they did. And I know my father always felt that was very important, that they be recognized. I'm glad that we were able to do that. I really am. And thank you for giving me this opportunity. The book has been translated into German, which makes me very happy. And the person who did the translation was Walter Schwab, the journalist who wrote the article. And when I asked her to do it, she was still a journalist writing. She said, I'm part of the story. I want to do this. So I'm thrilled that she did the translation. And it's been doing well in Germany. It's in German. So I'm very happy about that.
Awesome. I know because I read it through Kindle Unlimited, so I read a lot of books through there. It has the book, a lot of people have given it many great reviews and stuff, but a lot of people have read it, which I think is awesome. Like just
Yes.
on Kindle Unlimited itself, there was, I think, like 1,000 or something reviews, which I mean, those are just reviews. How many more people have read it?
I don't
But
know. I'm amazed too that it's done well. People have given it nice comments, which
yes, I definitely think your parents' story, and it's also your story as well, is one that I think people will enjoy reading and seeing another perspective of what it was like to live in Nazi Germany in Berlin during this time, a different perspective.
yeah. I think it's hard to imagine because it's your country turning against you, a country that you believed you were proud of, you wanted to be part of. If it wasn't for Hitler, they would never have left. Neither family. They were happy to stay. I think it's hard to imagine, but the world turned upside down and not everybody was successful. But I'm happy I could write that story and have it preserved for my children and for others who have read it. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Yes,
For
thank you
talk
for coming
to
on.
talk to you for giving me this opportunity. I appreciate it very much.
Yes, I've loved having this conversation with you today, and I think the listeners are really going to enjoy this story as well, the story of your parents. Thank you again to Evelyn for coming onto the show and sharing her parents' story of survival with us today. You can find Evelyn's book, Hidden in Berlin, a Holocaust Memoir, on bookshop.org, and I will have it linked in the description below. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.